welcome to this third talk in the series of talks on diversity in the Indian context as well as perhaps in the global context. This series of talks has the aim to give the audience an idea of the diversity that is present in our country and perhaps which is a general force behind the thriving of science in our country. This is organized by the Indian Academy of Sciences in association with the Academic Trust, which is its outreach wing, and also in association for the National Council for Science Museums. For this talk today, we have Professor Raman Sukumar, who is perhaps best known for his work on the Asian elephant. He's an ecologist. He works on the Asian elephant and the wildlife-human conflict. I'll read a little bit from the Encyclopedia Britannica entry on Professor Sukumar. So Professor Raman Sukumar, well, a fun fact is while growing up in Madras, present-day Chennai, Professor Sukumar was dubbed the Vanavasi, which means a forest dweller by his grandmother. I think this requires no explanation. It aptly explains that he loved the forest right from his childhood. He finished his PhD at the Indian Institute of Science in 1985, and he was professor at the Center for Ecological Science at the Indian Institute of Science. He's still attached to it. He has many accolades, which if I want to tell them all, it'll probably take up all the time, so I won't. I'll kind of select. Among the many important contributions, he helped design the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve, the first of its kind in India, which was established in 1986. I think there is no need to mention the importance of such green reserves these days. In 1993, Professor Sukumar became a member of the Project Elephant Steering Committee, which provided technical support and advice on matters of elephant conservation to the Indian government. He chaired the Asian Elephant Specialist Group of the World Conservation Forum, Conservation Union from 1997 to 2004. He also served as director of the Asian Elephant Research and Conservation Center, a special division of the Asian Nature Conservation Foundation, an independent organization that he had helped to establish in 1997. He worked on elephant habitat and the uninterrupted movement. That is, he designed certain corridors, which are of course important, so that the human-elephant conflict remains at a minimal level. He has written several books. His accolades include the Presidential Award of the Chicago Zoological Society in 1989 and the Order of the Golden Ark, this is from the Netherlands, in 1997. He is a fellow of the Indian Academy of Sciences and the Indian National Science Academy. He was a J.C. Bose Fellow. This is the last thing I'll say probably. In 2013, he was elected a fellow of the World Academy of Sciences. I think with that, Professor Sukumar, it's over to you because we are all eager to listen to you on the animal diversity.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Bhattacharya. And good afternoon, everyone. I put a rather simple title and quite a blank screen on the first slide, simply because I do not want to bias my talk towards my favorite species, which Professor Bhattacharya has already let out that that's the elephant. I'll of course refer to the elephant towards the end of my talk, but I'll not bias my talk by putting up an elephant picture because the animal diversity of India is, is so large and so wonderful. I cannot do justice by putting up photographs of that diversity on the very first slide. So please do bear with me. Okay, now before I turn to the animal diversity of India, I think it's pertinent to ask the question as to how many species are there on Earth, and especially how many animal species are there on Earth. Biologists have divided all living organisms, have categorized them into 5 different kingdoms. Chromista, protozoa, plants, fungi, and the animals. And when you look at the number of species, both that have been described so far, as well as those that have been predicted to be there, because we have not sufficiently explored and we have not described all the species that are found on Earth today. Even though man has landed on the moon, we have sent a mission to Mars and so on. We still have not described, perhaps we don't know. No one really has an estimate of what proportion or percentage of the actual species on Earth have actually been described by science so far. Now, if you look at this bar below, you will see that the number of animal species described is something less than approximately 1 million. But that does gross injustice to the total number of species which might be out there. And in the past 20 or 30 years, there have been varying estimates. The estimates go from a few million to 10 million, 30 million, sometimes even 100 million. There have been all kinds of estimates out there. And one estimate in 2011 by Mora et al. Put it at about 7.7 million species of animals out there. Okay, so we have hardly described about a seventh or an eighth of all the living organisms in terms of the animal kingdom on a global scale. And the uncertainty is very high, as I told you. There's a paper in Friends in Ecology and Evolution in 2014, where you can see the y-axis here is a log scale. So during different time periods in the past, people have come up with all kinds of estimates, and they actually are quite, you'll actually be surprised that it goes from, less than 1 million to almost 100 million or so. But perhaps there are, let's say for the time being, that there are about 10 million species on Earth. But I might be wrong and everyone else might be wrong, because new species are being described on a regular basis. Now we know that there is one well-known pattern in the distribution of species of biodiversity globally. This includes both plant diversity and animal diversity. And on plant diversity, you would have already heard a talk earlier in the series, so I shall not deal with plant diversity. But you will find a very similar pattern. And that is, you will find what is called as a latitudinal gradient in diversity. So when you go from the equator towards the poles, the number of species per unit area, declines, overall it declines. There are, of course, some more complex patterns when you go into individual regions and so on, but very, very broadly, one pattern that strikes you is that there is a decline in the number of species, as you go from the equator or the tropics towards the poles. And you can see that reflected here in this figure, in this map, global map. You see these very, very dark reds and browns in South America. That's the Amazon basin, and and the adjoining areas in South America have very, very high diversity. Also in Central Africa, you find very high levels of diversity in certain places. And then you come to Southeast Asia, you find high levels of diversity, especially in Southeast Asia and continental Southeast Asia too. Malaysia, Indonesia, and continental Southeast Asia, as well as northeastern India. We also have very high diversity in the Western Ghats, especially in the southernmost part, but it's not picked up on a global scale map. But we obviously do have very high levels of diversity in the southern Western Ghats. Now, this is just the amphibian diversity, the frogs and the toads and so on. And so here you will see this pattern very, very clearly, that the diversity levels of amphibians are very high in the tropics, especially the neotropics, in South America, or to a lesser extent in Africa, and still to a lesser extent in parts of Southeast Asia. But you will also find high levels of diversity in other parts, and the patterns are not necessarily monotonous as you go from the equator to the poles. It doesn't mean that the diversity always declines. For instance, you would have noticed that if you take North America, still the southeastern part of the United States and so on does have pretty high levels of diversity. Now, this is a topic that has been debated for a very long period. I'll just be very brief as to what are the reasons for this latitudinal diversity gradient that you get as you go from the tropics towards the poles at the global scale. The first explanation that is given is that there is a more stable climate in the tropics over evolutionary time. And therefore, when you have a very stable climate, the conditions are right for, for species to diversify, for species to, to persist, species don't become extinct and so on and so forth. So conditions for life are for life forms or living forms, including animals, are actually, most conducive in the tropical belt as opposed to the temperate or the polar regions. The second explanation is that you have high levels of primary production. By primary production, I mean production by the vegetation. And you obviously have very high levels of plant diversity in the tropics. And this is what supports the higher diversity of the consumers, which are the animals. And therefore, high levels of vegetation diversity supports higher levels of consumers, which is the animal diversity. And most recently, with regard to the mammals, it was shown in a paper in PLOS Biology that the tropics actually has higher rates of speciation. So there are more species that are coming up, per unit time or per century or millennium or whatever. And you also have lower rates of extinctions of the mammals in the tropics. Therefore, you can think of the tropics being the source of diversity. So, you have this big diversification, you have this high rate of speciation in the tropics, the climate is more conducive in the tropics, and this is a subject that I'll come to a little later in the talk. It has not undergone the major glaciations and the very frigid conditions during the last 2 million years, as you have seen in the temperate and the polar belt. And therefore, the tropics have always harbored high levels of diversity, plant diversity and animal diversity. And certainly with the mammals, that this is manifested in higher rates of speciation and lower rates of extinction. Both these are important. So you have more species coming up per unit time, and you have fewer extinctions taking place in the tropics. And that's the reason why you have higher levels of diversity in the lower latitudes. And from here, the species then start radiating, they start immigrating to the higher latitudes. Okay, we'll now come to India, because the primary topic of this lecture is that of the animal diversity of India. I obviously can't do justice to the animal diversity of India. Again, very vast. We almost mirror, as a subcontinent, we mirror almost the entire range of diversity, animal diversity included, that's found globally. You have all the major habitat types that you find globally in India itself. But one factor that has played a very important role in the evolution of, or the phylogenetic affinities of the Indian animal groups, is that of the Indian geological journey that started actually more than 100 million years ago, when India was part of the Gondwana land in the southern hemisphere. And then sometime before 100 million years before present, the Indian landmass or the Indian subcontinent broke off from Gondwana and started drifting northwards. All of you must have heard about the term plate tectonics, and over a period of tens of millions of years. But this journey was apparently quite rapid, extremely rapid. So between about 90 million years before present and about 40 million years before present, the Indian landmass eventually reached, the shores of Eurasia and started colliding with Eurasia 40 million years ago. And that gave rise to the Himalaya, which is, one of the youngest mountain belts in the world, and it's still evolving. It's still, gaining elevation with time as the Indian landmass, continues to collide and slide into the Eurasian landmass. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is that India was part of Gondwana land, which included Africa, South America, Australia, and so on. Therefore, our animal taxa have a lot of affinity with, species from those continents, which may not be very obvious to us today, but those relics are still found today when we talk about the diversity of the animal groups in the Indian subcontinent. Okay, so India being what it is today, it has a fantastic diversity of biomes and biogeographic regions. And if you look at all the different biomes in the country, you have the Palearctic biomes in the Himalayan region, starting from Jammu, Kashmir and Ladakh, going through the Western Himalaya right up to the Eastern Himalaya. The Western Himalaya obviously is a more frigid zone compared to the Eastern Himalayan region. We have the desert region in Rajasthan and Gujarat. We have the plains of the Indo-Gangetic basin. We have the Western Ghats with again a diversity in terms of rainfall going from west to east. We have the semi-arid zone of peninsular India. We have the Eastern Ghats, and we have the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which goes much further south, very close to the equator. So we have this fantastic diversity of biomes in India, and therefore the animal diversity of India kind of matches the biome diversity. So in a nutshell, practically most of the biomes of the world are actually represented in the Indian subcontinent. Okay, now coming to the actual animal diversity of India. Irrespective of how many species have been described, globally, the total number of species described today, according to, this is a table I have taken from the Zoological Survey of India, something like about 1 million plus species of animals. And in India, the number of species when you look at the vertebrates, 423, birds 1,233. This is in 2015. Okay, and fishes 3,022, reptiles 526, amphibians 342, and arthropods alone is about 73,000 plus. Okay, so most of the diversity, as with globally, lies with the invertebrate groups, especially the arthropod groups. In fact, a lot of the uncertainty in the global number of species of animal groups comes from the uncertainty in the number of arthropods, which include the insects. About 30 or 40 years ago, a biologist from the Smithsonian Institution called Terry Irwin, he did an experiment in which he did fogging. He did chemical fogging of the canopy of a tropical forest. And he collected all the arthropods that came down to the forest floor. And he tried to look at the total number of woody plants or the other plant species that are found in that forest. And he found that there are a certain number of species that are unique to and associated with the woody plant species. And from that, he made an estimate, a rough estimate of the total number of species that have already been described and that are yet to be described. So something similar that you can find, that the arthropods are the most diverse group in terms of an order among the animals and of any order of any living forms globally. So we have described something like 73 or 75,000 species of arthropods today in India, but this is a number that is grossly underestimated. It could be 10 times as high as what it is, or perhaps even 20 times or 30 times as high. I don't think anybody has a clear estimate of how many species of arthropods are there in the country today. Now, one taxon that has been widely explored in the country is birds. Okay. The birds have been described for a very long time, starting from the fauna of British India, all the British bird watchers who have described and written books about the birds of India. So it's very rare to find a new bird species. But remarkably, we are still finding a new bird species once in a while. In fact, the latest discovery was in 2006, when there is this bird called bugun. It's a new species, by the way. Okay. Discovered in Arunachal Pradesh, discovered by Ramana Atreya, who is interestingly a radio astronomer from IISER in Pune, and with a lot of interest in ornithology. And this bird had been sighted by locals, but nobody knew that it was a new species. It had been sighted 10 years prior to this. And when Ramana Atreya actually, saw the species, he recognized this as a new species. He collected a couple of specimen birds, tracked a couple of free, because there are less than 20 individuals of this bird called bugun. This is named after a local tribe called the Bugun in the Eagle Nest Sanctuary in Arunachal Pradesh. And now a whole little ecotourism venture has come up there. The Bugun tribe, they take great pride in having a new bird species named after their tribe, and they protect this habitat. So this is a very good example of a coexistence between a local community, because from the Northeast, you hear a lot of stories about people hunting and causing the extinctions of a lot of mammals and birds and other creatures over there. But this is an excellent example, the bugun of a creature that has been found. It's called, I mean, the discovery of the century almost, like, because it's been half a century since a new bird species, a new species has actually been described from India. You might get a new discovery of a bird that its range is not in India, its range is in a neighboring country like Burma, Tibet, and it's found in India. But the bugun was a very significant discovery. It happens, once in, in a blue moon. To discover new mammals is also very rare. But strangely, again, this is a mammal species that has been discovered by the Zoological Survey of India. It's a shrew species discovered, just this year. And this is discovered from the Andaman Islands. It's from the Narcondam volcanic island in the Andaman and Nicobar area. Okay, so we are still discovering new vertebrate species, especially birds and mammals, which is quite unusual. So although we're not likely to add to the tally of birds and mammals significantly, you can be sure that there are other taxa, like especially amphibians and so on, which will go on increasing over time because of newer and newer discoveries, which I will describe here. Okay, so this is this year. S.D. Biju of the University of Delhi discovered this new starry dwarf frog species called Astrobatrachus curchiana. Curchiana is named after a place in the Wayanad district of Kerala, and this was discovered in the Western Ghats. So the frog discoveries, I'll come to a little bit later in the talk, have been so frequent, and this is rapidly increasing the number of frog species in the country that, this is a news item of The Guardian which calls India a frog paradise. We have a spectacular mammals. We have the elephant and the tiger and the lion and the rhino and so on and so forth. We do have some spectacular birds, but if India is really a paradise for one particular animal taxon, it is really frogs. India is really a frog paradise in the world. And that's something very important for us to keep in mind when we are planning eventually for conservation of the animal diversity of India. And sometimes, species are discovered in the most unlikely places. Would you ever imagine that in the concrete jungles of Mumbai, there is a well in which they discovered a new eel species? Again, this is just a report that just came in very, very recently. It is published on the 30th of September 2021, just hardly published about three weeks ago. I have not seen the original paper for this. This has just come out as a discovery. It came out in a magazine called Down to Earth. Okay, and our newspapers and magazines have actually been quite prompt in reporting these discoveries. I'll go to the more scientific part of it a little later, but I just wanted to put this up because every new discovery, brings an excitement, and it is widely reported in our newspapers. But see where this eel has been discovered, Mumbai well, of the most unlikely of all places. Of course, you will expect a lot of arthropods to be described. And 2 new species of ants have been described by researchers from ATREE. And they have named this after Professor Ganeshaya, who's the doyen of plant ecological studies and one of the founders of ATREE. He's based in Bangalore. One of these ant species has been named after one of the species has been named after Professor Ganeshaya. So we can expect that when it comes to the arthropods, there's a whole new world out there. Many, many, many more species, maybe an order of magnitude more species, yet to be discovered using the new tools of molecular biology, not just the morphology, but new tools such as the tools of genetics and molecular biology that have yet to come. Okay, now here is a table I have taken from a report of the Zoological Survey of India, which is 2020. The Zoological Survey of India is the agency that is tasked with authenticating and reporting all new species. So you see here, the blue represents new species discovered by Zoological Survey of India. So over time, it has been increasing simply because there is more exploration being done. I think one of the heartening things about the science of ecology and natural history in India is that this is a subject that has, I think, caught the imagination of the public in terms of the need for conservation. It has also caught the attention of a new generation of young people, young students and scientists who are interested in natural history, who want to make a career out of natural history, who want to go and explore the wilds of India, who want to photograph the natural history of India, and so on and so forth. And therefore, the rate of exploration has gone up. And that is very, very heartening. Because if you look at the number of discoveries, they have been going up. Overall, they have been going up over time. The orange are species discovered by others, which is even more than that of the Zoological Survey of India. Okay. Then there are new records, and there are new records by others, from elsewhere. I'm not very sure from where these discoveries have come from, but you have both the Zoological Survey of India and other scientists and people, groups working in different parts of the country who are making these discoveries. Therefore, India is now being better explored, and we are increasingly describing the animal diversity of India. And yet the invertebrate groups are still, I think, very much underexplored in the country. Okay, now I'm actually going to go into patterns. Just like the global patterns of species diversity, we can perhaps ask a few questions about what explains the diversity of certain taxa or certain animal groups in relation to the biogeography of the country. Can biogeography provide some explanations for the diversity that you find in certain taxa? Okay, and therefore we first need to have a good database on species distributions. Now, this is very, very important. And using the new tools of GIS, which is Geographical Information Systems, using new approaches such as that of citizen science, especially with birds today, the Nature Conservation Foundation, led by an effort led by Sohail Kader, has an impressive program of recording birds across the country. All this is adding to our knowledge of how different species are distributed across the country. And then scientists can then try to explain these patterns, how these different patterns of diversity, low diversity, high diversity, or why certain species are found in certain areas, but not in certain other areas, and so on. They can then start coming up with explanations of this. Okay, I showed you the same map of the different biomes and the biogeographic areas of India. So these kinds of maps of distributions of species are today becoming available. And using computers and powerful tools of GIS, a lot of scientific analysis can be done, and new insights can be gained about the whole process of evolution, diversification, affinities, and so on, geographical affinities of different taxa of animals. So just to show you a few maps, the Asian paradise flycatcher, a beautiful bird, very, very widespread across India, Southeast Asia, probably even going into China. On the other hand, the Malabar pied hornbill is found in the Western Ghats and a part of the Eastern Ghats. You have the black-headed ibis, very disjointed distributions across Asia. You need to know why do you have all these different breaks? It's found in parts of Rajasthan, Gujarat, it's found in Western Ghats, then you have a big break, then it's found in Northeast India, and then parts of Burma, and so on. Then you have the forest owlet. This was again a bird that was rediscovered fairly recently, found only in Maharashtra, very small area of Maharashtra. Why is it confined only to such a small area of Maharashtra? Okay, these are interesting questions we need to ask, both from a point of view of scientific curiosity as well as from the point of coming up with strategies for the conservation of these species. The forest owlet could have gone extinct. It was rediscovered after a very, very long time period. For decades, nobody even knew that this species was still alive in the country, and it was discovered by a scientist from the BNHS in Bombay. Okay, now when you start looking at biogeographic patterns, one pattern that has been well debated is that of what is called, when you go, I told you earlier about the latitudinal gradient. That is when you go from the equator through the tropics to the temperate to the polar region, you get a decline in diversity. You also have patterns when you go from along a mountain range like the Himalaya or the Western Ghats, from low elevation to high elevations. You have certain patterns. Very broadly, you have a decline in the number of species, the richness of species per unit area, when you go from low elevation to a high elevation. Okay, but this is not universally true. In many taxa, you find what is called the mid-domain effect. That is, species actually start increasing in number. The richness is greater as you go from low elevation to a mid elevation, and then it starts declining. So there is a hump. And people have tried to come up with various explanations for this, which I will very briefly mention in the course of this talk. So here you look at in the Himalaya, a number of people have looked at groups like ants and amphibians and reptiles and so on. And then when you look at in the Himalaya, when you look at this gradient, elevational gradient, you find that ant species richness, okay, both in terms of genera as well as in terms of species, shows the mid-domain effect. The highest number of species is not at the low elevation at 200 or 300 meters. It is actually at about 1,000 meters or so, or 1,000 to 1,500 meters. Then beyond 2,000 meters, it starts declining. Okay, so the mid-domain effect is actually reflected here. Here, when you look at the distribution of amphibians, again along the elevation gradient in the Eastern Himalaya, you again find the good evidence for the mid-domain effect. So you find medium levels of diversity in low elevations, then the diversity increases, and then if you look at very high elevations, the number of amphibian species comes down. Okay, so you can look at it in different forms in terms of endemic species and non-endemic species and so on. But very broadly, this is the pattern that you find in the distribution of amphibians across this, along the elevation gradient in the Himalaya. But then when you look at reptiles, the reptiles do not show the mid-domain effect in species richness. Okay, so the same group that looked at amphibians, they also looked at reptiles in the same Himalayan elevation gradient, and they found that the highest levels of diversity are at very, very low elevations, and very quickly that diversity starts going down, perhaps because reptiles are very sensitive to temperature. So the higher the temperatures, it does not really support the metabolic functioning of reptiles, and therefore temperature perhaps plays a key role. So different taxa, animal taxa, respond differently in their biogeographic patterns of diversity that you see. And so there are very complex patterns that are embedded. You find on one scale, at the global scale, you find some patterns. At the regional scale of a mountain range, you find certain patterns. And then within regions, within mountain regions, you find other kinds of patterns, which I will come. Essentially, what has happened is that over time, if you look at the history of Earth over the past 2.5 million years, okay, this is known as the Quaternary, which is the Pleistocene and the Holocene epochs. Now, the Earth's climate has not been stable over the past 2.5 million years. In this figure, I'm only showing you the last 800,000 years, but you can extend this figure to 2.5 million years. And in the last 2.5 million years, the Earth has gone through approximately 25 or one cycle for every 100,000 years of glaciation and interglaciation. By glaciation, I mean that the Earth has become colder. The ice sheets have extended from the poles into the temperate belt, essentially all across the globe. And we know this essentially from a lot of evidence from the Northern Hemisphere. The Southern Hemisphere also went through this. The land has become colder, maybe 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 5 degrees. And so we have gone through these glacial and interglacial cycles approximately once every 100,000 years. Not necessarily so every 100,000 years, but very broadly every 100,000 years. So you have low temperatures and you have high temperatures. And the difference between the low temperature and the high temperatures, these have corresponded to the amount of the greenhouse gases. The blue on the top shows the atmospheric concentrations of the greenhouse gas carbon dioxide, which you hear about every day today. Okay, it's important for you to know that the amount of atmospheric levels of CO2 has fluctuated naturally in the past without humans having not having played any role in it. Today, in the last 200 years, humans have played a major role in increasing the levels of atmospheric CO2, but not in the last, but going back to the last 2.5 million years. This has to do with the Earth's orbital parameters which has fluctuated. And this is not a topic I'll go into in detail in this lecture. It's a topic that you can have a lecture by itself. Then similarly, you look at the amounts of methane, which is again a very important greenhouse gas. Again, in tune with atmospheric CO2. And the temperatures, the central graph here shows the atmospheric temperatures. So we've had some very warm periods in the past. You look at all these reds here, about 400,000 years before present, about 350,000 years before present, about 125,000 years before present. They've been much warmer than what it is today. And now we are entering a very similar phase. But also look and see that the coldest period that the Earth has undergone over the past 2.5 million years has been very, very recent. It has been just about 20,000 years ago. The 20,000 year ago period is called the last glacial maximum, which is actually being the coldest known period in the last 2.5 million years. And on average, the Earth was colder by 5 degrees Celsius on average. Okay, maybe not the tropics, maybe not, the temperate, the polar belt was perhaps even colder, but on average, the Earth was 5 degrees colder. And lo and behold, what happened is that the vegetation patterns across the globe were very different 20,000 years ago. And 20,000 years ago, remember, modern humans, Homo sapien, had already colonized the Indian subcontinent, had already come out of Africa and had spread all across the Indian subcontinent, just 20,000 years ago. This was the coldest period in the last 2.5 million years. India was a semi-arid area. Okay, I don't have a legend here, but the yellow indicates a semi-arid landscape. Colder periods means that the Indian monsoon was much weaker than what it is today. The monsoon essentially was weaker by 10, 20%, 30%, whatever it was. And India had a very arid landscape. Our tropical rainforests were not there. They were confined only to the northeast and to the extreme south of the country. The rest of the landscape was arid. We had ostriches in India. Where is the ostrich? You have to go to Africa to see the ostrich today. Then the earth started getting warmer, the glaciers started melting, and the Indian monsoon started strengthening, and the forest started spreading. So 10,000 years ago, we entered a period called Holocene period. And agriculture, this made possible the rise of civilizations. Agriculture was made possible by these warmer periods, more productivity, there was a higher amount of rainfall, and the forest started spreading, including tropical rainforest and tropical dry forests across the country. Now, this has influenced the pattern of distributions of many animal taxa. That's the reason I'm giving you this background. This very interesting paper by my colleague Umesh Srinivasan, along with a team with Krishna Priya Thamma and Uma Ramakrishnan, they looked at patterns of species richness of babblers, birds, in the Himalayan region, from the eastern Himalaya to the western Himalaya. And the murids, the rodents, again from the eastern Himalaya to the western Himalaya. So what is the pattern that you find? As you move from eastern Himalaya to western Himalaya, the species richness of both babblers, these birds, as well as the rodents, they decline and they become nested subsets. So the further west you go, you get a subset of the species of babblers and rodents and murids that you find in the eastern Himalaya. The explanation given is that the eastern Himalaya was not glaciated during the LGM 20,000 years ago or 22,000 years ago. Unlike the western Himalaya was very frigid, and life was not very easy there. Most of the species probably became extinct there, unlike the eastern Himalaya. And therefore, with the return of warm conditions during the Holocene period, these species then started recolonizing from east to west. The species started recolonizing. So only some species are obviously spread from the east to the west. And therefore, you get nested subsets of babblers and the murid rodents. And further west you go from the eastern Himalaya. Therefore, their explanation is that historical effects that you see, like in the latitudinal gradients, for instance, may be an alternative to conventional energy productivity relationships. So it may not just be that, okay, we know today that the eastern Himalaya has got higher rainfall, longer growing season for vegetation and so on, and therefore there is high levels of productivity. But you have these historical effects. You have these climatic historical effects that have played a role. And this is an alternative explanation. So it is not just the energy productivity relationships, but also climate and the historical trends of climate that have played a role in the distribution of certain animal taxa across the Himalayan belt. Similar patterns you can see at a finer scale in the escarpments of the Western Ghats, where again my colleague Vijay Kumar and a group and Karthik Shankar, they have shown in the Western Ghats escarpments, you have these sky islands. If you go to the highest elevations, these were warmer in the past, and this led to the upward migration of a number of frog species. And then, you have a big break in the Western Ghats in the Palghat Gap. This has given rise to two sister clades of frog species, and one north of the Palghat Gap and so one south of the Palghat Gap. And then you have other complex patterns. During the cooling and the warming phases, you have again allopatric speciation taking place, in these escarpments. And therefore, they suggested that the high elevations in the Western Ghats, they act as centers of lineage diversifications, while the mid to low elevations, they serve as museums or repositories, from which then the species go up and down, they diversify, then they probably migrate down during more favorable climatic periods and so on. And eventually this is played out across the continent, and this is a paper that showed in that the mammal species from different biogeographic pools across the country. You have the peak western diversity, which is semi-arid. You have the northern diversity that has the Palearctic elements, from Eurasia and so on. And then you have the peak endemic diversity in peninsular India, because this is not well connected to the other continents after the Indian continent came and collided with Eurasia. And then you have the Indo-Malayan elements, because from the northeast you have the connectivity into Southeast Asia. So you have the Malayan elements of diversity coming in. So you have these very complex patterns that play out in determining the diversity, the animal taxon diversity patterns in the country today. Now, genetics has been used as a tool, and with genetics has been used for phylogenetic studies, species delineation, new species being discovered, phylogeographic studies, and so on and so forth. I'll just give you a few examples here. A new species of macaque. This was discovered 2007. Again, discovery of new mammal species is very rare. And D. Chakrabarti, working in the lab of Anindya Sinha from the National Institute for Advanced Studies, they discovered this. The locals, of course, knew about the existence of this monkey, this macaque, which these people found through genetics. Both through mitochondrial DNA as well as through nuclear DNA markers, that this was a different species, distinct from other species of macaca. So they named this Macaca munzala, which is found only in one part of Arunachal Pradesh today. My colleague Praveen Karan's group has been looking at langur species. For a long time, the common langur that you see across the country, we used to call it Presbytus entellus. Then it became Semnopithecus entellus. Again, using a combination of empty DNA, mitochondrial DNA, and several nuclear DNA markers, they found that there is a case for 3 different species of Semnopithecus. That is the separation of the Hanuman langur. Apart from that, you have the Nilgiri langur, which is Semnopithecus johni, which is found in the Western Ghats. But they made out a case for 3 different species of Semnopithecus entellus, Hypoleucos, and Semnopithecus priam, which occupies different parts of the country. So genetics is today playing a very big role. Now, especially with frogs. Now, frogs are being discovered, new species are being discovered at a very rapid rate today. There's this very famous paper published in 2003 from S.D. Biju, who's called the Frogman of India, where he found a species that he named as Nessicabactrus, which actually genetically has a resemblance to India's to species from Seychelles, which actually is a throwback to India being part of the Gondwana lab. this is a remarkable discovery which was published in the journal Nature. So there's a whole new frog family found in India, which has affinities to, the ancient Gondwana divergence of frog lineage into India. So it goes back deep into time, into geological time. And then, he discovers species, literally by the dozen, almost every year, and comes up with all these very complex phylogenies. This is one example of, complex phylogeny of newly discovered frog species in the Western Ghats and Sri Lanka biodiversity hotspot. And I'm very envious of people who go on discovering new species, because I have never discovered a single species in my life. But then, my research has been confined to only a single species. I mean, only to the elephant. And however hard I try, I find that there's only one species of elephants, which of course for me is biodiversity, but then that's a different issue. So, in the Western Ghats too, many more new species are being discovered. S.P. Vijay Kumar, my colleague, certainly 9 species of bush frogs and so on. So genetics is playing a very major role in the discovery of species. And as I told you, however hard we try, we find there's only one species of Asian elephants. But there is population genetic structuring of the elephant. You find a population genetic structuring between southern India and northern India. You have 2 clades, an alpha clade and a beta clade that have diverged, more than 100 or 200,000 years ago because of the glacial interglacial cycles. T.N.C. Vidya, when she was a PhD student in my lab, did this work. And the interesting thing that we found was, even when you look at local scales, the entire Nilgiris, Asia's largest elephant population, is a single mitochondrial haplotype. And whatever genetic patterns people find across Asian elephants, both in India as well as in Southeast Asia, there's only one species, Elephas maximus. Therefore, I'm never likely to find a new species in my life. Okay, India remarkably is host to 40% of the world's wildcat species. You all know about the tiger, the most famous, and somehow it evokes a certain passion in humans that none of the other cat species evoke. But then these are the wildcats of India. The caracal, unique to the arid zone, the snow leopard in the Himalaya, the clouded leopard in the northeast, and the Asiatic lion confined to Gujarat, and so on and so forth. So India is actually the home of the cats, and with differing body sizes. I'll not get into details, but very often you don't know even where many cats are distributed. Some of the lesser known cats, for instance, jungle cat, leopard cats. So there are these niche models that people come up with, where using a combination of climate and biome and habitat, you can actually predict where these are likely to occur. I'll just take the last 2-3 minutes to talk about how do we conserve this fantastic animal diversity that we find in India today. We have this fantastic diversity, and India is one country in which in the last 100,000 years, we have, when it comes to the vertebrates, we have experienced among the lowest rates of extinction globally. Okay, that is something that I should have put up. This is coming up. This has come out from work done by Roberts almost 20 years ago, and more recent, or 10 years ago, and more recently by Advait Juker of Yale University, where they have shown that unlike the major extinctions that have taken place, even during the Pleistocene, across the world, you have this big extinction of the mammoths and a whole host of other large vertebrate species, in continents like North America, South America, Eurasia, and so on. The Indian subcontinent and the African continent have experienced very, very few extinctions. That's a topic for a different lecture again. How do we conserve the animal diversity that we have today? We need to map and identify hotspots of animal diversity. We can focus on the most diverse areas. But most diverse areas might be the Northeast. May not do justice to the arid zone animals that are there in Rajasthan and Gujarat. Therefore, we need to conserve and set up land in representative biogeographical zones of the country, and set up areas which are representative of this fantastic diversity of biomes in the country. Then we can try to use flagship species, because today we have very little time to conserve. So we can come up with a scheme by which we say, okay, these are flagships. The elephant is a flagship. The tiger is a flagship. We will try to set aside land for them. And in that land, you can also have a whole host of other species that might be found. And then in the case of very rare species, very endemic species, we need to have ex situ conservation measures. We need to have gene pools that we need to create. We need to do captive breeding and so on. Otherwise, these species will become extinct. So the question at the very end I'm asking is, and just one question is whether we can use species like elephants as flagships. So, species like the elephant, which we collared and we look at the range of an elephant, they move across landscapes. The elephant moves across a landscape of about 1,000 square kilometers. That was an elephant fitted with a GPS collar in North Bengal. Okay, very similar patterns that you get of about 1,000 square kilometers in the Northeast, in southern India, and so on. So you need to plan at the scale of landscapes for elephant conservation. So these are 4 regions of the country: the Western Himalaya, the Eastern Himalaya, the East Central India, part of the Eastern Ghats, and the Western Ghats, where elephants are found. And these are also among the richest for animal diversity in the country. So you plan for conservation of land for the elephant. That's what brings in the money, that brings in the political interest and the public interest. You also can conserve, perhaps. I'm not saying that is adequate. Okay, there's one approach is to use these species as flagships. So we put in a system of Project Elephant reserves across landscapes, which I had designed almost 30 years ago. This is in the Western Ghats. And this will encompass practically the entire range of all these areas that you're finding not only the largest elephant populations in the country, but also all these new frog species discoveries that are happening in the Western Ghats are happening in these hotspots of the Western Ghats. So perhaps you need to use a combination of all these different methods to be able to conserve the fantastic animal diversity of India. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you for the nice talk. And there are some questions. There is a question on the YouTube by Maitri B, who asks, is there an estimate of how many species will be extinct in the next 10 years due to global warming?
I'm not sure if you're asking about global estimates or whether you're asking about estimates for India. The global scale, people have make some estimates. Some of the early estimates made 20, 30 years ago based on species area curves and so on were found to be not really very adequate and a little bit alarmist. But I can't offhand, I can't give you an answer, but certainly it could be 20%, 30%. It will depend on the taxon and so on. But climate change, I think you have flagged a very important point, that climate change is really the one factor that's going to play a very, very important role. And all that I will say is that when I brought in the landscape approach, it is in landscapes that we can actually avoid extinctions through landscape scale planning. Landscape scale planning for conservation will have to go beyond protected areas, that is controlled by the government. It has to involve the participation of people, who will own land and who will have, land use that may not necessarily be favorable to conservation of biodiversity. We have to bring them as partners. We have to incentivize them. And that's the only way that we can avoid extinctions because of climate change.
Professor Sukumar, to begin with, I have rather a naive question to put. Why at all this diversity is to be preserved? What is the harm if we only have a selective sanctuary of some species that we would like to be around us? Is there any problem if we don't have that much of diversity and it is only a selective sanctuary of some species that we like?
Yeah, I think it depends. I think it depends on our value systems. People sometimes try to give, ecological arguments why you need to conserve species. And one argument that's out in the literature is about, the higher amount of diversity, the less the chances that you will get collapse of natural ecosystem functions and so on. And that's one kind of insurance, not only for the species themselves, but also for humans, that humans depend, finally it all comes down to humans because, that humans depend on biodiversity for human survival in the first place. And therefore we need to conserve biodiversity overall. But sort of going beyond that, when you have just a collection of species in a zoo, I mean, certainly you cannot conserve them because it would be the cost would be prohibitively expensive, and very often you don't even know how to really propagate plants or make sure that animals are able to reproduce in a zoo condition or whatever. Many captive breeding programs have failed because of our failure to understand how animals reproduce in nature, for instance. So you cannot really conserve everything in an ex situ situation. The world will be much poorer. The world will be much poorer, and what the implications eventually for human life is something that I really cannot really foresee because there are too many complex situations. We are a complex biosphere with a lot of biogeochemical interactions. There's interactions between land and atmosphere, land and ocean, and so on and so forth. So the conventional wisdom is that that humans need that humans also gain a lot, not only in purely selfish terms, in utilitarian terms from nature, but also in ethical and spiritual terms from having an engagement with nature and so on. So that is one part of the explanation. So yeah, I suppose that certain people will be totally happy to be living throughout their lives in a concrete jungle and be perfectly happy. But I don't think that the very, very hundreds of thousands of tribes in the Amazon will be happy, or people living in Africa, in the African continent, or myself for that matter. I don't think I'll be happy in such a world.
Sir, I came across some sort of research where people try to understand mathematically how multiple communities are related to each other, and how the extinction situations can be by estimating all such equations like Lotka-Volterra equations and all that. Now, what is your idea about that? Do you think that this sort of research can actually work towards conservation of the diversity?
See, it can essentially help us in planning for conservation. Let me put it that way. I don't think just that work itself will avoid extinctions. It will help us to slightly more intelligently plan for conservation. See, many years ago, as I told you, based on species area relationships, based on theories of stochastic models of what constitutes viable populations of species and so on, we started coming up with estimates of what's the minimum number of individuals that we need. Just to give you an example now, I told you about the bird Bugun, right? Now, the Bugun is there's just a handful of birds of Bugun there in that eagle nest sanctuary. Maybe 15, 20, I don't know the exact number right now. Does this constitute a viable population? Or just by some chance factor, will it become extinct? 1 year there is a very high rainfall, or 1 year there is a very low rainfall, or the temperature in that eagle nest sanctuary plunges for some reason. I don't know what the real needs of the Bugun are. And just by chance alone, 80% of them may just die in a given year when you have a handful. So people do come up with, a lot of mathematical approaches to trying to estimate, not only in terms of the minimum viable populations needed, but also in terms of habitats needed. I remember that there used to be the species area curve relationships, and you look at the extent of the protected areas today. Okay, so you say that, okay, you take an island situation. Okay, if a number of species are isolated on an island, okay, there is a certain rate of extinction that will happen. There's a certain rate of immigration that will also happen from the mainland. And depending on the size of the island, and depending on how close it is to the mainland, this is called the theory of island biogeography, and made famous by MacArthur and Wilson a long time ago. So you have a process of speciation is too slow. So you have extinction and you have immigration, emigration. Okay, and you have a certain balance. So the smaller the island, the further away it's from the mainland, the more and more species will become extinct. The larger the island, the closer it is to a mainland source, the more the chance that more species will survive. Okay, that's the convention. So based on that, people started looking at terrestrial systems, and we are creating islands of sorts. So you take a small sanctuary, 10 square kilometers in the midst of an agricultural landscape. there's no chance for dispersal of species from that to the larger landscape. So then it will undergo the same kind of an insular process. Okay, so you can. So this will help you in planning intelligently. That's why people say that you start putting up corridors, but sometimes dispersals take place irrespective of humans. Like at one time, many decades ago, people thought that tiger conservation is largely thought you set up protected areas for tiger. And these were individual protected areas. You have a corpet, you have a kana, you have a bandipur, and the tiger will survive. But no, over a period of time, people found that you need to treat this as meta-populations. You need to allow for dispersal of tigers from these, in between protected areas to move. But they then move through agricultural landscapes, through human settlements. Maybe you can mimic that process today. When it's not possible for you simply because human development, occupation of land has gone beyond a certain stage, then perhaps using science, we can actually do relocation. That's why when we designed Project Elephant, we took a landscape approach right in the beginning, that we need to have a system of corridors to allow the movement of animals, but not going anywhere in the country. Okay, today elephants are wandering all across Jharkhand and Odisha and South Bengal and causing lots and lots of conflict, human deaths. I'm not supporting that approach. So yes, we can use science to intelligently try and plan for conservation of species. And then in the context of changing climate, once again, how will species move? Species will have to move from lower elevation to higher elevation. Can we facilitate that in some form or the other?
There are two parts to the question from Madan Gopal. I'll phrase them as different questions. Has any study been done on how animals remember their routes for migration?
Oh, this is, it's too complex a topic for me to do justice. I will not, birds are supposed to navigate. Birds have long distance migrations, as you know, from virtually the almost Arctic Circle, Siberia to India and so on. They have these big flyways. They're supposed to navigate through magnetic fields, looking at astronomical cues and so on. How do elephants move between long areas, through memory of their landscapes and so on? It's too complex a topic. I'm sorry, I really can't really do justice to this topic at this stage. Yeah.
Okay. The other part of the question is, what are we doing to clear the elephant corridors that have been blocked?
It's a topic by itself. Again, I can give a whole topic. I can send a published paper to anybody who's interested. If they write to me, I can send a paper or a chapter. Just okay. In very put in. You have to do surgical intervention. In some cases, you might have to ask some people to move by buying their land, relocating them somewhere in a very small way. In many cases, the land is with the government, so they just have to protect their land and make sure that there is no further encroachment. They don't put up buildings. In other cases, like local communities can be roped in, as happened in Meghalaya, for instance, when they have declared land as corridors and so on. And sometimes when nothing else is possible, you can take animals from one side and put them on the other side if necessary. So I can send you a paper or a book chapter that I've written on the topic. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so I suppose he will write to you and then you can send him. I had a question related to that, but let's ask something that a participant has asked. Maitreyi B, can old species really be introduced from collected genetic samples, or is it just science fiction?
You mean you are trying to revive species that have become extinct, like the mammoths and so on?
I guess so. Well, it says from collected genetic samples.
Collected genetic samples, I suppose so. I mean, I'm sure that, with all the advances in genetics and molecular biology, you can get something out of it. Whether it will remain the same species or not, I don't know. I can tell you, maybe I can just share some thoughts with you about the recent news about cloning of the mammoth, the woolly mammoth. The woolly mammoth became extinct about 11,000 years ago across Eurasia and North America. It was isolated on a small island of the coast of Siberia, and where it became extinct about 4,000 years ago, called Wrangel Island. And using very preserved samples, people are now trying to see if they can clone the mammoth. But for cloning the mammoth, they need an Asian elephant surrogate mother. And if you do that, what is it that you will actually get? Would you be able to get a mammoth, is the mammoth habitat the same as what was there 11,000 years ago? The mammoth became extinct 11,000 years ago because of the climate change and the habitat change that happened. And those habitats, can you recreate them? You can't, because the climate is different today from what it was 12,000 or 20,000 years ago, right? It's much warmer today than what it was there. So you cannot recreate the frigid cold climates that supported the mammoth population. Secondly, if you clone a mammoth using an Asian elephant, would you have co-adapted gene complexes that would help them to survive, in those kinds of climates? Where would you introduce them? I don't know. So there's a lot of controversy over it. It could be a scientific curiosity, but the practical application of it, I don't think everybody accepts this. But the mammoth cloning project has got a huge amount of money, according to media, news in the media.
Professor Sukumar, whenever we talk about the diversity and all that, mostly we hear about the diversity of the bigger animals. But is there any particular study about the microbial diversity of the country, or is it a completely different subject altogether?
No, I think it's a completely different subject. People are looking at microbial diversity. It's not that people are not looking at it. But you're right. I mean, even in animal diversity, that's why I tried my best to bring in, to the extent I can, some of the smaller creatures, arthropods and so on. I don't think I did justice to it, but, you have to bring all that in. But as I told you, the heartening thing is today that the kind of research that's happening on diversity today is actually much more diverse than what was there 30, 40 years ago. 30, 40 years ago, it's not that diversity was not being studied, it was being catalogued. So you had during the British period, you had the Botanical Survey and the Zoological Survey of India. And pretty much, most of what we know today has been catalogued, by them and described by them. It was essentially taxonomic work. So that, that cataloging is obviously enormously useful. But today, the kind of work that's going on has spread out, a lot of the studies on animal ecology, behavior, and so on. It's not confined only to mammals or birds. It has gone down to amphibians, reptiles, fishes, down through arthropods, a whole range of other taxa. And a lot of young naturalists in the country today are actually finding, are taking great delight in studying these smaller creatures and lesser known creatures. Thank you.
And I have just a personal curiosity. I worked for some time in the Northeast, and I found that there people talked about one particular gibbon. They call it Hulu gibbon, and they say that it is only found at one side of the Brahmaputra. Is there any reason for such kind of localization? Or is
the dispersion. You have geographical. I have seen the Hulu gibbon, very close to Jorhat. If you go to Jorhat, you have the gibbon sanctuary. I've seen the gibbon there. It's found in a slightly larger area, but found south of the Brahmaputra. Simply because the gibbon perhaps never dispersed. The Brahmaputra is a formidable barrier. It's a geographical barrier. You see from one end of the Brahmaputra to the other end of the Brahmaputra. What you sometimes see are only islands, and even elephants do not disperse across the Brahmaputra. If you look at the population genetic structure of Asian elephants, it is only the male-mediated gene flow that has taken place. Only a few males once in a while may have swum across the Brahmaputra, and gotten across to the other side and maintain the gene flow. Unless you go to the very upper reaches of the Brahmaputra and all the other tributaries that come and fall into the Brahmaputra. You have the Dibang Valley, you have the Namdapha, you have all of those very rugged terrain. So you have a formidable geographical barrier in the Brahmaputra, the river. So that perhaps explains it.
Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you, Professor Sukumar, for the encouraging talk. We close the session.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. It's my pleasure. Thank you.